How do we really understand when the feast begins? There seems to be a lot of several different viewpoints out there. New moon, no moon, sliver moon, crescent moon, purple moon, whatever. And so the answer is simple but extremely complicated. And here is the short answer. So first, it's basically two questions. One is really, when is the new moon? And number two is how do we determine when the year begins, or when the monthly, the biblical cycle begins? All right, so the first answer on this is Jim Staley, Passion for Truth. This is what we believe as far as the calendar and this particular issue of the calendar. First of all, the priority from Yahweh's perspective goes in this order. It goes into the fact that you honor the feast with a minor in getting it exactly right. Okay? In other words, the law of extrapolation says that should I not celebrate the feast at all if I don't know exactly when I'm supposed to start it? You follow me? The logic from Yahweh's perspective would be no, do it anyway, based on what you see and what your conviction is, and I will be much happier than if you decide, no, I'm not going to do it at all because I don't understand it at all. He's always looking as a father for his children to try. Number two, but the actual belief system that we carry here at PFT is really more based on science, that the new moon has always been, in the Messianic community, it's always been a debate. It's never been a debate in science that the new moon is the dark moon. Hands down, period. The proof is mathematical. On the 14th, I think a lunar cycle, the lunation cycle, is 29.58073 days or something like that, to be generic. And so what happens is that we know for a fact, the check and balance on how is a new moon, is a dark moon, is that there are two feast days that happen on a full moon. What are they? Passover and Sukkot. Okay? So Passover and Sukkot happen on full moons, and we specifically know that it's at the evening of the 14th, right? We know Passover, the new moon, or the full moon is the 14th of the evening of that first month. So we know for a fact that Scripture says that the full moon happens basically on the day of the 15th, which is exactly what NASA says and the science says, that the full moon is on the 15th. Well, if you count backwards, okay, that the sliver is on the 3rd. So if you start the day of the month on the sliver of the new moon, then the middle of the month is never a full moon, which means that you cannot get the 14th of Aviv and the 14th of Tishrei, or the 15th of Tishrei, to be a full moon for Sukkot and Passover. So where it gets confusing is when you go back in history, the word Kadesh or Rosh Kadesh, the beginning of the new moon, is definitely the sliver. Now I know your eyes just crossed. Or wait a minute, didn't you just say it's the new moon? Okay, so you have to understand how the ancients thought. First of all, they are far more mathematical than you might think. Okay, in the first century, we can't even recreate the clocks that the Greeks had. They had clocks in every city that were down to the microsecond synced. We can't even duplicate that today. We don't even know how they did that technology. So it's not like they were just agricultural only. It's a very well civilized society. So we can't just believe that they were just shooting from the hip on these things. Year after year, they saw patterns in the skies too. For crying out loud, you have the Magi that are coming to Yeshua based on mathematics that we don't even understand today of things that they see in the sky. So when the Scriptures say that they observed a new moon, what that meant was, yes, they were observing a sliver of the new moon, but it was proof to them of what had already started. Look at the prophetic significance that's incredible. Is you have a new moon that is dark. It goes literally dead for almost 3 days. And about on the 3rd day, the sliver starts over again, and you see that new sliver, that new moon. In the same way, Yeshua was put into the ground, and about 3 days later, he rose from the dead, and the new moon, if you will, or the new month began. So the question becomes, when did your sins become forgiven? On the day that Yeshua died or the day that he rose again? Do you see that theological conundrum we have? When did he forgive our sins? According to the Torah, sins are forgiven when? At the moment the blood is shed. There's no resurrection of a bull or a lamb or a goat needed for forgiveness of sins. It is the blood that is the forgiveness of sins. The resurrecting of the dead only proves that it was his blood that caused the forgiveness of sins. Does that make sense? And so when we're dealing with the months and the cycles of the moon, the ancients understood that. It's just simple math. 15th of the day starts at the dark moon. The sliver proves that we're in the new month. There was tradition involved in the excitement of a new moon. That's why they had watchmen. We can't possibly think that they had not the intelligence to believe that the month had already started. And what happens if they have a storm for 2 months? Or a hurricane or something, the bad weather for 2 weeks and they don't see the new moon, they're going to start the month 2 weeks later? Not at all. We even have it referenced in the Tanakh that King David, before there's a new moon, says, tomorrow we're going to have a feast, or 2 days from now, I think he says, we're going to have a feast for the new moon. How can he say they're going to have a feast for the new moon if they hadn't seen the sliver yet? Because they had calendars, just like we did, okay? Or we do. And so the biblical feast days are based off a lunar and solar calendar. The months are designed off the lunar calendar. And so the next part of this question, which begins the complicated part, so in my opinion, that first part was the easy answer. The second part becomes more complicated, is when does the year begin? So the way that they calculated the years back in the first century is not typically as cut and dry as what you see on the internet, okay? So there's a lot of people, in the movement that we used to be a part of, the Hebrew Roots movement, that get all bent out of shape over this calendar issue. I mean, they won't even eat dinner with you if you have a different calendar, okay? It's a really, really big issue to them. You're serving a different God if you have the wrong calendar, according to them. And you'll see all kinds of information on the internet about when do we do it by the Aviv, meaning when the barley becomes ripe? Do you do it by when the spring equinox? Do you do it by a combination of 10, half a dozen, or the other? And the answer is, it is all of the above. When you actually do real historical homework, from Josephus to Philo, which are writers in the first century, Jewish historians, and then you take the Bible context into consideration, and then you take the Talmud, which is the rabbinical writings of how they dealt with issues in how to walk out Torah and different things. You begin to find that this was a majorly debated topic even in the first century, okay? Majorly. This was not like, oh, this is the way that they did it. This is the way they argued it, would be a better way to say it. The old adage, if you have 2 rabbis, you have 4 opinions, is very true, okay, in the first century. And so, but Philo tells us in history, in his writings, that everything was calculated by the spring equinox, okay? And so when the spring equinox hit, that's when they knew, typically the next new moon after that was what started the Aviv, the month of Aviv, of how they would calculate every month from that point on. The problem became, remember, this is an agricultural society. These are farmers, okay? So imagine if we did a calendar system that only went by Aviv. You would have Passover starting sometimes before or after Aviv, or a better analogy to make it really clear is the end time harvest festival, which is called what? Sukkot. We're right on the heels of that right now, okay? Imagine if they set a calendar the wrong way and Sukkot, or the harvest festival, came before the harvest. Okay? That's absolutely ridiculous. You can't have a harvest festival before the harvest. Nonetheless, otherwise, you can't have it a harvest festival a month after the harvest. Otherwise, you're sending the farmers back into their fields during the rainy season to plow for next year's spring harvest. It can't happen. So there were big problems, even in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th century, of how to solve this calendar issue because of the farmers. That would definitely not be fair if you had in the spring the barley come into Aviv, but then they decide not to have Passover for another month. Because according to the Torah, they can't harvest their barley until the high priest harvests the first sheaf offering, which means now their barley is rotting in the field. And then they lose an entire harvest. God would not be want that to happen at all either. So it wasn't as clear and cut as a lot of people think that it was, that it is online. There was lots of debates on the issue, but it definitely revolved around the spring equinox. And so that leads me into part 3 of why we choose to use the Hillel calendar. A lot of people say, we did have one question, why do you not keep the Aviv barley calendar instead of the pagan Babylonian-inspired Hillel one? I love how people set up their questions.
Yeah, that's in logic, that's called a false dilemma.
That's right.
It's like, so are you a Republican or an idiot? It's kind of
right.
And I mean, it's
or when did you stop beating your wife?
Yeah, I mean, there are more options than the two that you give. But,
right.
Yeah, I think that's a really. Do you mind if I?
No, jump in.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's a really important question. And for one, why do we go by the Hillel II calendar? And in the 1st century, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, the feast days were determined by the leadership of Israel, the Sanhedrin in the land. And they would calculate the feast days for the rest of Israel. And so the Hillel II calendar, for those of you who don't know, that is the traditional Jewish calendar. It's the calendar that pretty much all of the Jewish people use except for Karaite Jews, and most Messianics use that calendar as well. And so so it was Hillel II is the one who is credited for coming up with this calendar. And what it is, it's a pre-calculated calendar because they were forecasting and basically saying, okay, well, how are we going to be able to still keep the feast days with the disbandment of the Sanhedrin coming up? And there's going to be no Sanhedrin anymore to determine the days for the rest of the people, and everyone's going to be doing what's right in their own eyes. We need to have some kind of unity in this. And remember, what Pastor Jim was saying earlier is that the point of the feast days, the point was not to get the day right exactly. The point was to come together and fellowship in community, which is why we're commanded to have a holy convocation. That's part of the commandment for these feast days, is to have a holy convocation and to come together. And so we can't do that when everyone has different ideas of when days begin. And so the leadership was involved in coming up with marking the dates for the calendar so that all of Israel could come and celebrate the feasts. And so forecasting that, that's why they created this pre-calculated calendar. And so, so that's the calendar that we go by precisely for that reason, is because we don't live in Israel. There is no Sanhedrin right now. I don't have the authority to fly over to Israel and blog about, I saw the new moon, so, therefore everyone must listen to my judgment on when this starts. Who am I? Who is anybody? Who is the authority? And I believe that the authority was given to Hillel, who was the Nasi of the Sanhedrin at that time, to be able to make this judgment in order for us to keep the feast the best that we can today. And so we agree with that judgment until Messiah, Yeshua, comes back and sets us all straight on the issue, until there's a new Sanhedrin that's built up with the authority to make these types of judgments. But until then, we go by the judgment of the Sanhedrin in order to keep the feast days to the best of our ability, to have holy convocations and to come together until Messiah returns.
Right.
So,
And secondly, Hillel, again, what he's saying, just to emphasize, is that the whole purpose of putting together the calendar with Hillel II, which, by the way, Hillel I was a contemporary in the first century, okay? So this doesn't come by just some guy off the street. I mean, this is like one of the most renowned rabbis in the first century, hands down. And so the idea was that in the first century, Jesus himself, Yeshua, was going by the rabbinical authorities himself. He was submitting to the Sanhedrin's decision on how they celebrated the feast day calendar in the first century. You do not see Yeshua a single time bucking the calendar system that the authorities that were in that place at that time were observing. You don't see it. You don't see him bucking the Shabbat and going, you're doing it on the wrong day. If there was a problem, he very much would have done that. But obviously, he went along with that calendar system, which moves itself into Hillel II, and then it just got codified to make sure that not only is the calendar operating exactly the way that it will work for all of Israel to stay in unity, but that at the end of 19 years, or the end of a certain period of time, if they kept if they did not adjust it, it would be so far off that they would be Passover would be like in February, okay? And it's because of the 365 and a quarter days. And so you had to have that leap year in the United States, same way. The calendar had to be adjusted. So without going any further into it, because it can get a lot deeper and a lot more detailed, and we're not prepared to give a teaching on the calendar, but wanted to just give our perspective on why we use the Hillel calendar is because we believe that was the last designated authority that even Yeshua himself submitted to the calendar system when all of Israel was together. And so we're going to agree with our Jewish brethren for the sake of unity that we want to be in unity with you on the calendar system, which is working for all of Judaism today. Can you imagine the witness that we would have, and this is just my opinion, you can disagree and passionately disagree, I'm still going to love you, is that, you know, as let's say that as the Messianic movement moves along, and as the Christian Roots section of that moves along, and God gives us more favor, more prominence, and more influence, and one day, you know, I get an opportunity to meet the head rabbi of Israel, and we sit down and have coffee together, and I have the audacity to tell him that, by the way, I've been in this movement for 10 years, Rabbi. How long have you been in this movement? Your calendar is wrong. Did you know that? Our relationship wouldn't go very far because of the arrogance that would be portraying to our Jewish brethren. So I have chosen for this ministry and our family to not make mountains out of molehills. And that relationship is by far the most important, especially since nobody can prove it ultimately when it all is said and done.
If you were blessed by this teaching, please consider helping us reach the nations by making a donation today. Thank you, and God bless.